Yes, there we go. Also, we already have people in. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for people to settle a bit. So if we give ourselves one more minute and then we will start our today's webinar. Oh,
that's good. Deborah could come. Hi, Deborah.
yes. Hello, Deborah. There's a chat mode which is available for everyone. So please feel free to use the chat for any comments or questions you might have. It's always slightly awkward the first minute or so when people are arriving, but I think we're all got used to this already. Right. Okay, I think we can start and people can join us throughout. So good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome. My name is Joanna Kostka, and I'm a co-director of the Center for Child and Family Justice Research. And thank you so much for joining us for From Insight to Action, our monthly online talk series hosted by our center. And these series were created as a space where research, lived experience, and professional practice can actually genuinely meet, not just to present findings, but to ask what those findings do in the real world. How ideas travel, how do they change practice, and how might they challenge the system we work within. And across the year, we'll be bringing together scholars, practitioners, artists, and community voices whose work pushes us to think differently about children, families, and of course, justice. And the aim is simple, but, but ambitious, I would say. And it's to move from insight to action, to explore research that doesn't just sit on the shelf, but speaks to policy, practice, and public understanding in a very meaningful way. And I'm especially delighted to welcome you to today's session, which sits, I think, beautifully within the spirit of creative, critical, and practice-oriented inquiry. So we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Stella Bolaki from the University of Kent. Stella is a reader in American literature and medical humanities and co-director of the Center for Health and Medical Humanities. Her work sits at the intersection of literature, visual culture, health, and lived experience, and she has been at the forefront of thinking about how creative practice can function not only as expression, but as knowledge, testimony, and intervention. And today's talk, Artists' Books as Method and Testimony, Creative Practice in Researching Maternal Adoption Laws, draw on participatory workshops in which mothers created artists' books to explore their experiences of having children removed from their care through state intervention. And for those of us working in social work, family justice, health, and related field, I think this talk offers a particularly important invitation to consider how creative and participatory methods might expand the way we listen, learn, and respond. So we're really honored to have Stella with us today. Stella, thank you for being here, and I give you the mic over to you. You have 45 minutes for your presentation, and then hopefully we'll be able to collect some questions and perhaps even answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for this very, very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thanks to everyone who is attending. Hopefully, everyone can hear me okay. I will share my slides. Okay, so I'm hoping everyone can see the slides. Yes? Yeah, I can see some nods. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so I'll be reading from a written version so that I can keep to time, but I will do my best to keep it clear and accessible. So I'm beginning with, I suppose, an acknowledgement of how conventional research methods can often struggle to capture the depth and complexity of the emotional experiences associated with adoption loss. And this is particularly the case for mothers whose children have been removed from their care through state intervention and placed for adoption. Their experiences are shaped not only by grief, but by shame, anger, fear, and the persistence of maternal bonds that do not disappear with legal severance. So these experiences are difficult to articulate in academic research settings. So if we think about interviews or surveys, sometimes they can feel constraining or unsafe, particularly when mothers anticipate judgment or feel that their words may be misunderstood, discounted, or used against them. And as scholars have shown, many mothers hold back in interviews, not because they have nothing to say, but because saying it feels too risky. And I think this is where we begin to see perhaps the value of interdisciplinary, participatory, and arts-based research approaches, not as an alternative to rigorous research, but as a way of creating more meaningful and ethical conditions for understanding. So I want to start my talk by acknowledging some other projects which have put in practice the importance of creative interdisciplinary approaches, and which I've had the privilege to familiarize myself with while doing the project that I will be presenting today about. And so these are projects that are addressing the feelings of grief and loss experienced by mothers through creative approaches. A trailblazing example that I'm sure participants will be very familiar with, as it is underpinned by research led by Lancaster University, is the Giving Hope, Hold On Pain Easies, a not-for-profit social enterprise dedicated to reducing the trauma experienced by mothers and babies separated close to birth due to safeguarding concerns, especially through the Hope boxes. And of course, this project has been led by mothers with lived experience. Emma Geddes has also conducted research on mothers' utilization of artifacts associated with their adopted children, such as toys, clothing, and blankets, reflecting upon the meanings that such keepsakes had taken on in their lives after loss. And another example is the work of Lisa Morris, who is here with us today, and Sivon Beckwith, exploring the significance of tattooing for mothers as a form of expression and strategy for healing following the removal of their children by the state. And all of these initiatives demonstrate the value of a range of methods and the contribution that these methods can have to complex legal and policy issues related to mothers' mental health and well-being. So the research that I'm presenting today emerges from an interdisciplinary collaboration that brings together legal scholarship and scholarship from the arts and humanities. I will say a bit about my own background, which, as you heard from Joanna's introduction, is in literary studies and in medical humanities. So I'll say a little bit about my own background shortly. But here I want to acknowledge my research partner, Dr. Samantha Davey. In an ideal situation, we have presented this talk together, but it wasn't possible on this occasion. So Samantha is lecturer in law at the University of Essex. She has a passion for interdisciplinary and intergenerational research, and has published books like the ones that you see here, A Failure of Proportion, Non-Consensual Adoption in England and Wales, and Grandparents and the Law, Rights and Relationships. So our collaborative research, which forms the basis of this talk, explores the creative medium of the artist's book, and I will say a bit more about what that is in a minute. And it explores this as both a research method and as a form of testimony, broadly understood, in researching maternal adoption laws. So Joanna already mentioned that we did a series of workshops in which mothers created their own books to explore lived experiences of non-consensual adoption. So I want in my talk to reflect on the expressive, connective, and for many participants, healing potential of creative practice. I also want to address how material, visual, and narrative approaches, which the artist book combines, can deepen, hopefully, an understanding of maternal loss and resilience, and also address how some of these insights from our project might be taken up thoughtfully and ethically across professional practice, policy, and public education. And I would be really grateful to hear your thoughts, especially on the latter. So the work Samantha and I have undertaken has been supported by research funding that both our universities have that is dedicated to doing research that has impact outside academia. And so that's the Kent's Participatory Research Fund, Research England funding, University of Kent's Impact Acceleration Account, which is from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and some funding from the Centre for Public Policy Engagement at Essex. And I wanted to mention those funders not just in gratitude to them, but also to situate the research within its institutional and policy context. So as part of this research then, which is centrally concerned with translating insights beyond academia, our overarching vision has been to support mothers in creatively exploring experiences and emotions that are often difficult to articulate due to trauma and stigma, and to foster connections with others who have had similar experiences. And our aims as part of that vision have been to support mothers in processing their feelings, on navigating healing and empowerment within a safe and supportive group environment, primarily through our workshops, to strengthen professional practice by building capacity among practitioners to use creative methods, such as the artist's book, in their work, and finally, to increase public awareness of the challenges mothers face and highlight the importance of providing effective post-adoption emotional support through the books themselves, but also through exhibitions and other outreach activities that I will be talking about. Before turning to the creative practice we developed through our workshops, it is important to briefly outline the legal and social context in which this work is situated. I cannot do justice to this topic in the way Samantha would have done through her expertise, but I will attempt this briefly in order to contextualize our work. So the first thing to say is how our research interprets non-consensual adoption or adoption without parental consent. There's, of course, a legal definition in the Adoption and Children Act 2002, Section 52, which specifies that such adoptions are based either on parental incapacity or on the welfare of the child. And in these cases, the court applies a welfare checklist to determine whether adoption is in the child's best interests. However, our project interprets non-consensual adoption more widely than the statutory definition alone. So our project encompasses mothers who felt unable to provide informed consent to the adoption of their children due to their own vulnerabilities. So this includes younger mothers who were financially dependent on their families, as well as women who were under 16 when they became mothers. So in these cases, consent may have been formally given, but it was not necessarily experienced as free, informed, or meaningful. And this broader framing of non-consensual adoption is crucial. But we've also worked with mothers associated with historic cases of forced family separation, practices across the UK, Ireland, Canada, and Australia during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which, as we know, resulted in newborn babies being unnecessarily taken away from unmarried mothers and placed for adoption without regard for the mother's and children's needs or wishes. So a key partner of some of the work we have been doing is Movement for an Adoption Apology, a UK-based non-profit organization which is campaigning for mothers and babies, now adopted adults, who were separated by these forced adoption practices. More recently, we've also engaged in our workshops mothers and adopted adults who are seeking justice in the context of Northern Ireland's truth recovery process into mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, and workhouses. So while I will primarily refer to contemporary cases, I think it's important to acknowledge that despite these different social and legal contexts, there are striking parallels between mothers' accounts of the experiences of separation and the impacts of their losses in those historic cases and contemporary research on mothers who experience child removal in family courts. And I'd like to mention here another collaborator of ours, Danny Taggart. He's a clinical psychologist at the University of Essex, and he's got a forthcoming chapter in a volume edited by Samantha on precisely this topic. Samantha's edited volume is titled Empowering and Supporting Vulnerable Families Through the Family Justice System. And Danny, as part of that volume, has a chapter that explores those parallels between historic cases of adoption and contemporary research. And I would say that our workshops, which have also involved an intergenerational group of mothers, really attest to these similarities and how important it is to acknowledge and learn from them. So returning back to the legal and policy context in terms of the contemporary examples, there is a lot of work that shows that the legal duty to protect the welfare of mothers following adoption today is limited, and in some cases effectively non-existent. So some local authorities offer better support than others. It's a bit of a postcode lottery, and where support is provided, it's often problematic in terms of its source, its length, its timing, and its form. For example, it's not always trauma-informed. As a result, many mothers experience adoption as a profoundly traumatic event. They describe navigating a complex and enduring range of emotions, grief, loss, guilt, and shame, including what has been described as a living bereavement. And they do that in conditions of isolation and vulnerability. Many mothers also speak of being silenced throughout the adoption process and of having had negative or damaging experiences with the professionals involved. So many report feeling stigmatized and in some cases dehumanized by the systems and practices that led to the permanent removal of their children. So all of these point to broader structural limitations. So existing legal and policy frameworks are poorly equipped to protect mothers' welfare before, during, or after the adoption process. So just to give an example, as I said, some authorities might provide more support than others. But in general, after adoption, most women are offered only a small number of counseling sessions. One of the difficulties is that many mothers are not ready to engage with support services during care proceedings or immediately after adoption. And counseling that is provided by state authorities is often met with distrust, anger, or suspicion. So by the time mothers feel ready to seek help, they may no longer be eligible for free services. So timing remains a significant issue when it comes to support. And one of the wider problems identified in the literature is also the cycle that can occur when women do not receive adequate support. So Karen Broadhurst's work on recurrent care proceedings has shown how women who lose children to adoption often go on to experience further pregnancies and further state intervention. Many, as I mentioned, do not receive the support they need during care proceedings or in the aftermath of adoption. Their grief is not processed, their trauma remains unaddressed, and the conditions that led to the initial intervention often remain unchanged. So the result is a cycle of loss that compounds harm across the life course. And here I just point to a few other sources in the literature of people researching in this area who have addressed the lack of support. So it is within this context that the collaborative research I've been doing with Samantha seeks to recognize and amplify the voices and perspectives of mothers whose children have been adopted without their consent using the Artist's Book tool. In our workshops, we primarily focus on not only on the experiences, on mothers' experiences of the family justice system and on the support they have or have not received in the aftermath of adoption, but also on broader questions of identity and recovery in examining the lifelong impact of adoption and separation on their well-being and lives. My own background, as I mentioned, is in literary studies, and for many years I have been working on illness narratives, stories of lived experiences of illness within the interdisciplinary field of the medical or health humanities. So through that work, I became interested in the artist's book, and you can see some exhibitions that I did before meeting Samantha, featuring books that explore experiences of illness. So I became interested in the artist's book, not in the way an art historian or a curator might be interested in, because I'm neither of these things. I was more interested as someone who researches narratives, stories of illness. And I became particularly interested in how this versatile art form might enrich the ways in which lived experience that resists straightforward narration can be communicated. So experiences that might be difficult to verbalize, to articulate only using words. So when Samantha approached me to collaborate on this project, I found myself revisiting the characteristics of artists' books and considering how well they lend themselves to this kind of work. So what is an artist's book? For those of you who are new to this, an artist's book is a tactile, visual, and interactive form. It allows for the communication of ideas, emotions, and experiences through a combination of words, images, textures, materials, and structures. As an art form, the artist's book emerged from independent publishing movements of the 1960s and 70s, and it has a long history of challenging how we think about art and how stories can be shared. And I'd like to believe that at its core, the artist's book is democratic. In other words, anyone can make one. You don't need to be an artist by training. And I also really like what this particular visual scholar and artist, Johanna Drucker, says about the artist's book. She writes that the artist's book balances between enclosure and exposure. So if we think about a book can facilitate private expression, but it can also become a vehicle of broad communication. And as such, Drucker says the book offers a form of intimate authority. Drucker says in particular that women create authority by structuring a relation between enclosure and exposure. So giving voice to their issues on their own terms, deciding how much to expose and how much to enclose. And this quality makes the artist's book particularly suitable for experiences that are difficult to articulate publicly, such as non-consensual adoption, where trauma, shame, and fear of being judged are pervasive. Perhaps the distinctive power of the artist's book is best encapsulated in the words of one of our workshop participants. And this is what she said: "I was immediately drawn to the project because I sensed the potential of the workshop to give me a powerful voice in a way that didn't actually involve me speaking to anyone about what had happened." And as she continued, books, I think I said on the day, also they carry authority, and creating one gives you a sense of agency and authority of your own story. You finally know how to articulate your own truth about what happened to you and what it did to you, and you coming out of the being silenced place. That particular the final line, coming out of the being silenced place, I think is really important here. But also there is another aspect of the artist's book that I find important to highlight, and that is the materiality and tactility of this form, which is very central to its expressive power. And here you can see the words of one book artist. She was the first book artist that encouraged me to do research on the artist's book, and she was creating books to document her experiences with illness, but what she says is true of the form more broadly. And it highlights how important it is that these books are made to be touched, held, opened, and unfolded. So there is something about the tactility of this medium that helps counter the abstraction that often surrounds adoption in legal and policy discourse. So legal processes, as well as clinical models of grief, can render the emotional and human dimensions of adoption invisible. And I think by contrast, the artist's book foregrounds feelings, embodiment, and presence. It allows, therefore, emotional truths to be conveyed in words that often words alone cannot convey. And as you can see here, are some examples that showcase the variety of expression and communication that this particular form allows through different textures and designs. So just to move now to the workshop structure, our project has involved primarily a series of creative workshops in which mothers were invited to create their own books. The workshops were designed with careful attention to ethics and recruitment, and we have provided an account of our selection criteria, which I don't have the time to address here, in a co-authored article that Samantha and I published in the Journal of Social Welfare and Family Law in 2024. And that's an open access journal article, which you can easily download and have a look at. So while we were recruiting our participants, we encountered reluctance rather than lack of interests. Some mothers agreed to take part in our in-person workshop. That was our pilot workshop, but subsequently found themselves unable to travel on the day because of how they were feeling. This led us to explore alternatives to face-to-face workshops. So while in-person workshops can foster connection, online workshops proved more accessible for many of our participants, allowing them to work in familiar spaces and to choose whether or not to be visible to others. So we conducted most of our workshops online. Each participant received a pack of art materials along with guidance during the workshop on how to make a simple book. And we used open-ended prompts throughout the workshop to support participants and encourage imaginative exploration. Participants were provided with papers of different textures and colors and sizes, alongside collage material and a variety of bookmaking tools and art supplies. And they were also invited to gather any small objects, such as photographs or memorabilia or anything else they had at home that they considered meaningful, and if they wanted to incorporate that into their books, and some of them did that. And one of the methods that we used to prompt participants at the start of the workshop was inspired by the work of book artist and educator Darian Goldin-Stahl, with whom I had collaborated previously. So you can see on the slide here, the participants were invited to choose a word corresponding to an emotion or state of mind relevant to any aspect of their experience of adoption. And because language is often inadequate when it comes to capturing feelings, particularly where trauma remains unspoken, the prompts, the questions that you see here, invited participants to think in sensory and metaphorical ways. So we asked participants, for example, to think about what is the color or texture or size of the emotion they had chosen. Participants were asked to jot down notes, or to make some mental notes without sharing anything. And these notes would become helpful later on when it came to selecting materials. At this stage, further prompts and images of artist books were used to support participants' confidence. So they were shown how to create a simple book form and encouraged to experiment with the materials that they had in front of them or the materials that had been posted to them. So they were free to include text or symbols and work beyond language to populate their book. And more importantly, participants were invited to imagine what their chosen emotion, those words that I showed you before, might look like if it was a piece of paper. So participants were encouraged to think about how they might fold, layer, expand, color, alter, or decorate the pages of the books they had made so that the book itself becomes an embodiment of their emotion. And as I said, there were images like the ones I'm showing you now to give them ideas, to show them what other artists have done when making their books and how some of the techniques artists use, whether this is stitching or collaging or hiding something, can help communicate particular feelings, emotions, and experiences. And participants could choose to focus on a single profound moment from their experience, from their life, or they could use the turning of the book's pages to capture the passage of time and share their journey. And as a sequential form, the book is ideal for that. Usually when we open a book, it has a particular sequence to it. And that was something that mothers could mobilize here. They were also invited to think about the audience for their book. For example, are they making a book for someone else? Some of the mothers made books for their children, others made books to address professionals, and some made books for themselves, to address themselves. And during the workshops, mothers worked at their own pace for around an hour. The whole workshop, for your information, was around 3 hours. And during the making time, I was able to offer individual guidance on techniques, on materials, respond to questions, and support participants as they developed their ideas. And then for the final part of the workshop, mothers had the option to share anything they wished about their books with the group. To share each other's work. There is research in different contexts that shows that using images or objects can sometimes make it easier for people to communicate about experiences that might be difficult to speak about directly. And we found that this was the case. During the virtual workshop, in particular, there were many moments of connection and solidarity as people were showing pages from their books. And these were often expressed through body language rather than words. So a nod, a sigh, an empathetic look. And some of that body language was captured in a short video that Samantha and I produced to document the workshops. This is available to watch from our research website. You can see the link at the top. Yes, it's a short video that shows some of the books and some of the mothers talking about their experience of the workshop. And after the workshop, we also received further photos and feedback, additional comments, and some of the mothers wrote some blog posts, which again, you can find from our website. So we found from our workshops and from the books that were made that the artist's book medium became a tool of agency, healing, peer support, and community. It was experienced like that by many of the mothers. And I want now to show you some of the books that were made by mothers to illustrate the benefits that and the ways in which this artist book tool was experienced by them, while at the same time offering some further reflections on our overall approach in the hope of showing how narrative, visual, and material methods can work together to deepen understanding of mothers' experiences. So the mothers who took part in our workshops have described the invitation to make an artist book as deceptively simple. What I mean by that is that it looks like, the workshop looks like a crafts activity, but ends up being experienced as something deeper. It's important to say that our work was not framed as art therapy. Neither I nor Samantha are art therapists. And we are both academics. We did have support in place for the workshop. So we did have a therapist who was able to provide a supportive group conversation with mothers afterwards. But the workshop itself was not a form of art therapy. However, as many of the mothers acknowledged, externalizing and giving shape to something, literally by making a book, to something that is difficult to communicate due to trauma or stigma, can feel healing. And what helped that kind of healing effect was the fact that mothers were working together with others through this in a kind of a group setting. So there was a collective spirit of shared empowerment. The workshops themselves, another kind of important, I suppose, thing to note, the workshops themselves, as I said, are not art therapy, but neither are they about creating art with a capital A, if you like. In other words, the point of the workshop is not to make the best book. It's more about exploring the value of this tool as a form of creative expression and as testimony in the broadest sense when exploring mothers' lived experiences and relationships with institutions that affect their lives. As I mentioned at the start, what silences many mothers is fear of judgment. So there are public perceptions of adoption that tend to place responsibility onto them. And as already mentioned, there are many instances where mothers find themselves actively silenced. Churchill Fellow Jeannot Farmer has written in a blog post on our website the following: many mothers across the generations have no real understanding of how and by whom decisions were made and where responsibility for the loss of their child lies, so they have no coherent story to tell anyone who asks. And I think the idea of having no coherent story to tell, which points to the difficulty of making sense and communicating one's social experience, is a distinct form of injustice that can cause deep harm to a person's sense of self. And I think here is important to bring in an important concept by moral philosopher Miranda Fricker. She's used the term epistemic injustice, which is a wrong done to someone in their capacity as a giver of knowledge, a capacity which is essential to human value. And Fricker has identified two forms of epistemic injustice, testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. The former occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to not believe or take seriously a speaker's words. So if we think about the context of adoption, prejudices, especially class bias, whether this is conscious or unconscious, pose a risk when defining good or acceptable parenting that informs decisions to remove children. So low-income parents are often blamed for issues such as poverty that are beyond their control. Another kind of epistemic injustice is hermeneutical injustice, which occurs when society as a whole lacks a framework to understand particular experiences. And in this case, historic practices of adoption that I mentioned earlier can serve as an example of such systematic injustice. Because as we know, the moral attitudes of the time towards unmarried mothers not only led to forced separation of families, but also made mothers' experiences of trauma and violence unspeakable. And that's a form of hermeneutical injustice. So making an artist's book in the context of silence, institutional harm, and stigma can be a way of addressing and redressing forms of epistemic injustice. So exploring and validating thoughts and feelings for oneself, which is what happens in these books, without needing to meet anyone's expectations, can feel freeing and empowering. Unlike a print on the wall that is more public, with an artist's book, an experience is enclosed and safe between a book's covers. So it can still be shared, but with one person at a time. A maker of a book can choose what to display and what to conceal in her book. The book, therefore, can serve both the desire for self-protection or containment and a desire for recognition through this intimate sharing. And all the books I'm showing you now are books made in our workshops. Certain imagery recurred across books made in our workshops to convey grief and pain. So there are lots of hearts, hearts pierced by barbed wire, split hearts, images of stabbing, words describing torture and helplessness that appear repeatedly. At the same time, many books express continuing maternal bonds. Umbilical cords were fashioned from tissue paper in some of the books, or fashioned through rope. Hands connected symbolized connections that remain despite the separation. C-section scars were marked as proof of motherhood, asserting maternal identity in direct opposition to the stigmatizing language of birth mother. Here is another book that was exhibited in one of our exhibitions that explores the stigmatizing effects of language, what it means to be referred to as a birth mother. And it's a brilliant book that takes this concertina format. And on one side, you've got all these statements about what a mother is, and on its other side, you've got the statements about birth mother, often stereotypical statements, and this book manages to communicate in this way. Also, it uses, as you can see, different colors, pink and black, so it communicates in all of these ways. Many of the books also addressed oppression and injustice. So some participants represented the court as a secretive or carceral space, using imagery of prisons and sentences. One mother described feeling condemned to a lifetime sentence for being a victim of domestic violence. And you can see how she created, using tissue paper and string, this image of the prison here in her book. And so the idea being that her trauma was compounded, her trauma being subjected to domestic violence was compounded by losing her children to adoption. The physical acts of cutting and collaging, which are used in bookmaking, can also help release and process, quite literally, emotions, including emotions that are not tolerated or which are often used against mothers, such as anger and rage. So the anger is poured into the book, and you can see here how this is expressed through the style of the handwriting, the capitals, the exclamation marks. So this embodied act can feel cathartic, but it's also a moment in which some kind of testimonial injustice is overcome. Because this mother, whose book pages you see on the slide, told us that she expressed in her book what she could not say during care proceedings for fear, we can imagine, of being labeled aggressive or hostile. So her words and thoughts and feelings can now be reclaimed through this book. Other participants created compelling visual narratives by recollecting and reshaping fragmented memories and personal records. And a few of them used and reinterpreted well-known works of art and literature. So they embedded in their books images from stories like Alice in Wonderland, Picasso's Weeping Woman that we can see here. We can also see a print from William Blake's Pity. There was also a mother who incorporated the words of the tender lullaby from the Disney animated film Dumbo, Baby Mine. So these images, when placed within the context of personal loss, acquired new meanings because they reflected mothers' stories back to them, granting authority and recognition. So we can see through all of these examples how through color, innovative textures and bindings, as well as metaphors and symbols, these books articulated the truth of mothers' experiences. Using Lisa Dietrich's terms, these books can be described as both affective and effective testimonies. I think they turn inward, helping mothers reflect on and process deeply embodied emotions, but they also turn outward when they address others, not just the mother's children, but also the legal and social care institutions that have shaped mothers' lives. And so in doing that, the books support healing and self-understanding while also acting as tools for advocacy and change. And I would say that their personal and public dimensions are closely connected, allowing them to speak powerfully to wider questions of social justice. And the idea of effective testimony can be applied more clearly in the context of the work we've done in Northern Ireland. As I mentioned before, we've done a series of creative workshops in collaboration with Danny Taggart, that were designed for people affected by mother and baby institutions, Magdalene laundries, and workhouses. And so we explored how the rich tradition of artist books can support testimony sharing in alternative ways. As we know, formal testimony processes like the one currently happening in Northern Ireland, in the case of public inquiries, sometimes the formal processes can feel cold or distancing. They may not give survivors the space they need to convey deeply traumatic histories. And so we facilitated some workshops in Belfast and Omagh that were attended by mothers and adopted adults, and they led to this exhibition. You can see some images here that took place this year, called Unredacted, an artist book exhibition, curated by the people themselves who took part in our workshops. And there are plans for this to tour elsewhere in Northern Ireland, showing how art can be used to strengthen social justice campaigns. Since these workshops, some mothers have chosen to submit the books that they made as part of these workshops into public archives and as part of their formal testimony processes. And to me, that shows that these books are not just personal keepsakes, they are living documents that assert dignity and challenge official records and silences. The title Unredacted was an example, was the title that they themselves chose. And in the context of Northern Ireland's public inquiry, they demonstrate that testimony is not only something that is written or spoken, it can also be crafted, held, and passed from one pair of hands to another. At this stage, it's important to note that while celebrating the truth-telling, resilience, and hope that I see conveyed in these books, we must also draw attention to the ways in which sometimes arts and health initiatives may be used to justify the lack of welfare provision in mental health and other support services, or to divert attention from the collective responsibility we have as a society to support those in need. I particularly appreciate British journalist Polly Curtis's book, Behind Closed Doors. Some of you might be familiar with it. The full title is Behind Closed Doors, Why We Break Up Families and How to Mend Them. And in this book, Curtis advocates equally for putting empathy, reflection, and relationship between professionals and parents at the center of the care system, and for structural change. And she talks about particular concepts such as radical tenderness and relational activism. Similarly, I hope that this project speaks to the ways in which creativity and arts and humanities methods can investigate and illuminate social and public issues, not by distracting us from essential systemic change, but by acting as springboards for social justice on the way there, while also having intrinsic value for mothers whose perspectives and experiences have been deeply marginalized. And I'm kind of close. I'm going to close my talk by just a few slides talking about the workshops we've been doing at this stage of our project, collaborating with professionals. So we are interested in collaborating and learning from organizations that are committed to supporting mothers, and we would like to explore how some of the work we have developed can be integrated in existing services as self-expression and emotional support for mothers, and to facilitate life story work and post-adoption contact with children and families. So as part of that, we run some workshops for social workers, counselors, psychotherapists, art therapists, clinical psychologists, and barristers. I'm not going to read out that feedback, but that's some of the feedback we received from some of the professionals who attended our workshops. We have collaborated with organizations like Pause and Adopt London to explore some of the uses of the artist book in practice. And these workshops invited professionals to make their own books. They very much they were adapted following the workshops we'd done with mothers. And we used for those a concept that comes from Rita Sharon's work, that is the parallel chart. As I mentioned earlier, my background is in literary studies and medical humanities, and Rita Sharon, who is a medical educator, has used this concept in her work. And the parallel chart is a kind of concept that forms part of Sharon's broader articulation of narrative medicine, which she defines as a form of practice grounded in the narrative competence to recognize, absorb, interpret, and be moved by the stories of others. So in creating the parallel chart, Sharon acknowledges that sometimes professionals do not have a place where they can record their own emotional experiences and the impact that the stories of their patients have on them, because they cannot record that in the official chart where all the medical data goes. And so she develops the parallel chart as a way of doing that. This particular concept has been used outside of medical education, including in social work, because there are parallels between medical professionals and professionals like social workers. For example, they both work within highly bureaucratized systems. And therefore, what we've done through inviting our professionals to make artist books as parallel charts is that we took this idea from Sharon and revisited it as an artist book. Sharon thinks of the parallel chart as something written. We invited our professionals to make books like the ones you see on this slide, and think beyond language. And through the books they made, the reflective practice that these books encouraged meant that practitioners could reflect on their own emotional responses, on their assumptions, on their positionality, think about existing hierarchies, sides of privilege, including their own implications within them. And Samantha and I are currently writing an article that summarizes a few of the insights that we have gathered through doing that work. It's going to appear in the same volume that I mentioned earlier that Samantha is editing, titled Empowering and Supporting Vulnerable Families through the Family Justice System. So as I mentioned, we are working with a few organizations such as Pause and Adopt London to explore more practically how our workshop model can be integrated in their existing support services. And we have received feedback that suggests that our work can perhaps be adapted in varying contexts, not only to support mothers, but also adopters, foster carers, and adopted children and adults. We've also spoken with professionals who find that it has a lot of potential to be a more accessible form of expression for people with learning needs and disabilities. And finally, and this is an area that I'm really, I would be very grateful for anyone's comments or thoughts or suggestions. I've been thinking about the interesting affinities that our work has with life story work, Life story books, as we know, are valuable tools for adopted people to access information. They originally took the form of scrapbooks, but they have evolved over the years. And as we know, there are many issues surrounding the creation of life story books, and most notably the fact that mothers and other family members are often excluded from this process, which is detrimental to all. And so several professionals we interviewed following our workshops emphasized the importance of life story work and encouraged us to think about the ways in which our work can feed into life story. And I'd like, in finishing, to mention a particular charity with which we are collaborating in the Northeast called Blue Cabin. They've done a lot of work on creative life story work. They did a lot of research on that and rolled it out in collaboration with a particular local authority and rolled out their work on creative life story work. And so there are developments in that area that point to the need to establish more collaborative rather than traditional life story work. And our work feeds into that, or hopefully can feed into reimagining life story work towards this more creative direction and perhaps addressing some of the limitations of traditional life story practices. So in concluding, by foregrounding the embodied, affective, and relational forms of meaning making, I hope this project will contribute to challenging dominant narratives, enriching professional practice and creative space for more compassionate and just responses to adoption loss. You can find more information on our project website. I mentioned some of the papers that you can also consult. Thank you very much for listening. This is just a slide with some of the work I've referred to, and I think I can stop sharing now.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely amazing, and I think we're all going to leave this with a deeper understanding of how creativity can actually improve our knowledge and our ability to understand. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to put them in chat, or I believe I have a right to give you a mic if you raise your hand. I'm not sure, but please share on the chat any possible questions. I think you covered so many things, and as a moderator, I'm going to give myself a right to ask you the first question. And I think what's really great about this method is that it captures silences. Traditional, quantitative and qualitative research, is limited, as you said in the very beginning. And when we deal with trauma or slightly, petrifying contexts, those silences are often invisible. Do you think that this is a way to really encourage people to process, to share, and also to collect data?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That's a brilliant question, and it always makes me think of the atmosphere in the workshops, because there are periods of intense silence, which is a good silence, very kind of meditative, soothing, cathartic. There are moments of conversation, especially when we've done workshops in person, but also online, where people might break the silence. But there are also moments of immersion and silence where things are working internally, and it's a very beautiful moment to witness. I always, as a facilitator, feel very humbled by those moments of silence, because they feel very, very meaningful and necessary rather than awkward. And so, yeah, I really like this question and the invitation to think a bit more about the role of silence and how it can be part of the process rather than something that, as you say, in our impatience to collect data, we don't know what to do with silence. But with this, even when it comes to sharing work, like showing a page from the book, there are also moments of silence where someone is reflecting back on how that page came about. Maybe they started doing something first and then they changed. Or maybe someone might say, oh, this is what I see in that page. And so silence is also used while someone is actively thinking, what was I feeling when I made that page? Oh, now that I'm looking at it again, perhaps it means something else. So yes, I agree with you. I think silence in research, that's a very good area to explore, I think. I haven't had a question before that invited me to think about silence so actively. So yeah, I'll definitely think more about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's a question from Jasmine. This was really powerful and interesting. Thank you so much. If it's not too personal, I wonder if we could please talk a little bit more about your own emotional labor in this work and what the strengths and challenges of this kind of work, thinking of balancing the meaning and value of the work, but also the emotional work it requires.
Yes, again, another brilliant question. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a question that I return to a lot, and I have lots of feelings. I have lots of feelings in all sorts of that go in all sorts of directions. I don't know if the question is inviting me to, okay, so the strengths and challenges of this kind of work. There are many challenges to begin with that in terms of especially what I mentioned earlier, which was engaging mothers with our process, explaining what this is about, alleviating any concerns about and mistrust about academic research more broadly. Framing this work is quite challenging. As someone who is an academic, I'm not an artist, neither an art therapist, I find that sometimes it's difficult to explain what this is about and what this work means. At the same time, for me, as someone who teaches students, I'm sensitive to, facilitating work. I've done many workshops in the past with artist books, but this whole area was very challenging for me precisely because of the stories I've heard, the trauma in the room, the experiences that mothers share that make you feel really, often I felt, okay, well, I know this workshop can have some healing effects, but ultimately when people are presenting life circumstances, things that they find have no control over, you're kind of feeling yourself a little bit helpless and thinking, okay, what are these workshops doing to improve their lives? So I think that's why towards the end of my talk, I suppose I was a bit aware of some of the arts and health initiatives and how sometimes they can appear a little bit like, okay, they are perhaps I don't know, creating a space for mothers to talk about these experiences, but what is going to change when it comes to their lives? Are they going to have their children back, which is what many of these mothers want? And so it's been difficult to negotiate some of these aspects of the workshop, explain how this is not about providing legal support or creating a situation where these workshops can be used by someone to say, show that they are, that they deserve their children back and all of these things. That's why I mentioned that some of our selection criteria were quite important in that sense. So we, for example, didn't engage with anyone who had active care proceedings. We wanted to differentiate that kind of work. In terms of the strengths, I would say this project has really opened my eyes because before being involved in this, I myself had very little knowledge about the care context, mother's place, and particular challenges, especially when it comes to support following something as traumatic as adoption. So in that sense, the public awareness that I mentioned, our project is trying to address, I suppose I'm the first person who kind of had that awareness, kind of realized through their work and through meeting mothers and hearing their stories, what is missing, and kind of finding very difficult to justify why this kind of support is not there. why some of these experiences are not rendered legitimate or are not, cannot be expressed and acknowledged. So yeah, I don't know if I am addressing that question fully. I mean, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, because I could be talking about this question a lot. So I don't want to, if there are other questions, I don't want to take more time, but I would say that it is a very important question.
I think you've done brilliantly. So thank you for being honest and really reflective. We have another question. I'm curious as to whether there are similar spaces for fathers, and what was the rationale for focusing these spaces exclusively on mothers?
Yeah, again, another very good question. Again, we've thought a lot about how to engage more than mothers in our project, how to open up those workshops. We haven't done that work because we wanted very deliberately to focus on mothers, precisely because of their perspectives and the dearth of scholarship on these perspectives, and so we kind of had to create that, had to delimit the scope in this way. That doesn't mean that these workshops cannot be useful for families. As I've said, in our work, we've tried to engage, especially in the work we've done with Northern Ireland, we've tried to engage kind of adopted adults rather than, so we kind of open it up in that way. But I would say that, yes, that's something that is worth exploring, and perhaps there are organizations that are offering services for fathers. I think in general, men and creative tasks like that. It's interesting how many of the workshops I've done with this medium are always women dominating those spaces. We tried, even in the previous work I was doing with exploring artist books in relation to health, we had very few men signing up in our workshops. So there is something there about expression and some of the things that I've been talking about, that sometimes men are more reluctant to engage in those processes. But I think it's a brilliant idea to try and open those workshops. There's nothing to stop them from being open to fathers and to families more broadly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for a brilliant presentation, and absolutely, depth and insight that I will carry with me at least for a very long time. Thank you all who joined us. Please keep an eye for upcoming events. Another one is on March 23rd. And Polly Baines, a PhD student and a social worker, will talk about the experiences of parents visiting children in care. So we have a lot of events. If you have any questions or if you want to contact Stella, please contact us or Stella directly. And this is a recorded session, so I will be sharing the links with everybody. And again, if you want to present or if you have ideas, please let us know. And thank you again very much.
Thank you,
Stella.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.